Yeah, so you can go ahead.
Right, thank you very much for joining us. So this is a program that we put together at Center for Social Innovations with REFASHIOND Ventures, and with Brian, who is a venture capitalist and also a very experienced person in the area of supply chains, to engage us on the world as a supply chain. And this is a program that is in support of the Ghana Digital Innovation Week, which is seeking to be able to mobilize collective action and also catalyze investments and within the innovation ecosystem to be able to drive local level development. For us as partners, we want to be able to use this as a launch pad and be able to move on from there and see what kind of opportunities there are to be able to explore within the Ghanaian startup ecosystem that deals with supply chains and using digital technologies and innovation as enablers to be able to drive the sort of growth that is needed, and also explore how ventures like what REFASHIOND is doing could also be of support here in Ghana with respect to support going out to supply chain startups and the likes. These are all opportunities that we seek to be able to explore as next steps from this event. And so we want to be thank you, and for those who are not able to join us in time, this will be recorded, and as it's recorded, the content will be made available, and others could also take advantage of the content and be able to be part of the next step items. Thank you very much, and I leave it with you, Brian, for you to continue.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Yao. And let me just share this presentation. Actually, let me stop sharing because it looks as if I need to make it full screen. View full screen. I'll share my screen. Okay, so thank you guys for taking the time to join for the conversation this afternoon. The introduction that Yao gave was quite thorough. And I'm going to suggest, if you don't mind, that you take yourselves off mute, since we are a relatively small group. I really want this to be interactive. Obviously, if there's background noise, perhaps stay on mute till you have a question to ask or something to say. But otherwise, I really want this to be a conversation more so than me just talking about the subject. So we'll start with a little bit about REFASHIOND Ventures. So we are a supply chain technology fund. We're just getting started. If venture capital is relatively new to you, I think the things that are important to note is that raising a venture capital fund is very difficult in the United States, especially if you're someone who doesn't have the sort of social network or the family background that would make it easier for you to raise capital from strangers in order to invest in companies that you haven't specified at the time when you're raising the capital. So we're building a venture fund. Our thesis is that when you think about where the world is going, supply chain technology is the biggest investment opportunity of our lifetime. And I'll get into some of the reasons why later on. So a little bit about me. If you've paid attention, you probably have guessed that even though my name looks a little strange, I am probably Ghanaian. So I come from the Upper West region. I come from a village called Namvili in the Upper West region. I went to boarding school in Wa, and then I did my A-levels at Presec. left the United States and left Ghana in '97 to come to college in the United States. I grew up in Nigeria though. So like I said, come from Ghana. I grew up in Nigeria. My parents have lived in Nigeria since 79. And so that experience of growing up in Ghana and in Nigeria, I think has played a big role in how I think about the world, how I think about supply chains, and why it's something that has grabbed my attention in the way that it has. And my co-founder is American in terms of heritage. Her family comes from Puerto Rico. In some sense, Puerto Rico is very much like places that one might find in West Africa. My uncle has lived there for about a decade, and it says it reminds him of Ghana. And so in that sense, her experience is not too different from mine if you dig beneath the surface. And that's why I think we make such a great team. So let's get to the heart of the matter. What is a supply chain? And I like, in conversations of this sort, I like to start with some simplifying definitions, because supply chain is one of those topics where if you don't have a definition that level sets for everyone to ensure that you're all talking about the same thing, different people can be saying supply chain and they can mean completely different things. So for example, I was talking to someone in Taiwan about a year and a half ago, and she made the observation to me. She said, Brian, when someone in Asia says supply chain, they probably mean manufacturing. When someone in North America says supply chain, they're probably thinking about logistics. And so a definition is important. So the definition I like, this definition is based on a book by a professor called Martin Christopher. And it's a famous book. If you look online, it should be easy to find. But basically, a supply chain is a network, and that network is a network of organizations. And the network is created in order to help those organizations to collaborate with one another. And the reason they collaborate with one another is to enable the movement of products and services from whoever produces those products and services to whoever wants to consume them, right? So it's really simple. It's a network of organizations that enables production and consumption. That's the simple way to think about it. Now, the interesting thing that is happening now is that because of how much of an advance has happened in the development of digital technologies, a lot of the supply chains that we rely on are becoming digitally enabled, right? So it's not just a truck with a stupid box that is unconnected to anything around it. It's a smart truck that's connected to the internet, that's carrying a box that's connected to the internet. And there's a free flow of information between the truck, the things in the box on the truck, and the internet and everyone else on the network. Now, obviously, some of these things I'm describing are more advanced in certain parts of the world than in others, but generally that's the direction in which the world is moving. So in talking about supply chain, we can think about supply chain in three broad categories or three broad areas. The first one is supply chain management. And supply chain management is really focused on answering the question, what should my network look like, right? So again, remembering that a supply chain is a network of organizations, and the reason you create this network is to allow the organizations to work collaboratively with one another to enable production and consumption. Then the question is, well, given what I want to accomplish and what I do as a company, what should my supply chain look like? And so you'll have a team of people in supply chain management whose job is to answer that question. And of course, the design of the network, the components of the network might change as time progresses. And supply chain logistics, and I think of supply chain logistics as really being the linchpin of everything that happens in supply chain. Supply chain logistics is focused on storage, transportation, movement of things, right? So it's get the thing from the source to whoever needs it for production. Once the good has been produced, now move it from from where it was produced to where it's going to be consumed. And obviously what that entails is there's shipping, there's trucking, there's air freight, there's rail, there's storage, there's distribution, there's retail, right? There's retail. That's part of the logistics chain, right? It's at the end of the logistics chain, but that's part of the logistics chain. There's first mile logistics. There's last mile logistics. All that is an integral part of the supply chain. And then last but not least, the supply chain finance, right? While all this is happening, while all this activity is taking place in the network, people and organizations participating in the network need to get paid. They need to get paid. And I think the way that I think about supply chain finance is that it's not only about the money, because in order to pay people, you need very granular information about who did what, when they did what it is they did, whether they met the expectations that were set in whatever contract or agreement was entered into between the parties. And then based on all those assessments, right, what are they owed? What are they owed and when are they owed it, in what currency and whatnot? So supply chain finance is a lot more than just money. I actually think of it as information. And so then what you're probably starting to realize is that there's an aspect of the supply chain which is really just moving things, just moving the physical thing that has been made, right? And when I talk about it, I talk of this as the physical supply chain, right? This is the supply chain that gets you your car. There's a supply chain that ensures that you can buy food in the market. There's a supply chain that ensures that you can buy sneakers in the store if that is what you want to buy. But associated with that supply chain that is moving physical things that we can touch and feel, is another supply chain which is concerned with information. And I talk of that as the information supply chain. And the two have to work in tandem. The two have to work in tandem with one another, because if they don't work in tandem with one another, then the whole system breaks down. So I'm going to pause at this point and see if anyone has questions. You know, I'd love your thoughts on does this jive with what you think about when you think about supply chain? Is this what you were expecting? You know, are you like, whoa, what's Brian talking about? This is not what I expected when I signed up. And a few more people have joined. So to everyone who came in while I was running my mouth, welcome. Douglas, do you have a question? Do you have a comment? Dr. Tina J, do you have a question, comment, complaint? And if not, I'll go on to the next section.
I don't want to even interrupt. The way I'm enjoying the presentation,
Oh,
So,
thank you.
yes, yes. You've given me such an exciting view of supply chain. I've never heard it explained like this before, and it's exciting. I'm really looking forward to what else you have for us.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's continue. I think if 2020 and 2021 have taught us anything, it's that, the supply chains that we took for granted before the pandemic were not as resilient as we thought they were, right? So we all, life before the pandemic, was, let's say life was fine, right? The supply chains worked the way we wanted them to work. We could get the things we needed when we wanted it. Definitely in the West, I use the United States as an example. Definitely in the United States, people took supply chains for granted. I mean, so Lisa and I have been pitching the fund, since, let's call it 2019. In 2019, when we were pitching the fund to people and we said, hey, we're building a supply chain technology fund, we think is the biggest opportunity in the world. We really think this is something that people should invest in. We got comments like, one, isn't supply chain just boxes and trucks, dirty boxes and dirty trucks? Why does anyone care about supply chain? And so on and so forth. And then the pandemic came, and you've all kept up with the news, I'm sure. And people started to experience shortages, right? Supply chains were disrupted. In one sense, they broke down. In other senses, they became clogged. At least in the United States, I'm not sure what the situation is across West Africa, but at least in the United States right now, the concern is that the ports of Los Angeles and the ports of Long Beach are congested. I think the latest count is that there are something like 70 container ships waiting in line at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. It's a port complex, right? So it's two ports very close to one another. And so at those two ports, I think there's something like 70 container ships that have been waiting in line. And that number has been around 70 for a few months now. I'd say probably definitely the last 3 months or so, it's hovered around as 70, and it could be something that has extended back as far as 6 months. So as you can imagine, what that means is that goods on those container ships that were destined to go to stores, to warehouses, to distribution centers, to people's homes, those goods are still on those ships, right? They haven't made it into the port, onto the truck, to the distribution center just outside the port, and then on to their final destination. And so what that raises, again, I talked about supply chain management being how you think about designing your supply chain network. So that raises the question of what kind of system are you designing? And there's a great book, one of my favorite books, The Starfish and the Spider, The Unstoppable Power of Leaderless Organizations. But in the book, the authors describe, two big categories of organizations or systems. A spider is what we would think of as a centralized system or a centralized network. And when you think of a spider, right, if you cut off the spider's head, which is the command and control center of the network, if you cut off the spider's head, the spider is dead, right? The system breaks down. It's not going to function. The other type of system that they describe is what they use the starfish as an analogy for. And in the case of the starfish, when you cut a starfish, when you cut off one limb, the two different pieces each grows into a new starfish, a new complete starfish. So the one limb you cut off grows into a starfish on its own. And then looking at the picture on the screen, right, the portion of it that had 4 limbs now grows a 5th limb. And so now you have 2 starfish instead of 1. And so as we move beyond the pandemic, yeah, we're hearing your I think you're talking on the phone. Put yourself on mute. Right, as we go through the pandemic, if you were a company whose supply chain was more centralized in nature, right, now the question you have to ask yourself is if you should become more decentralized or more distributed, right? Should you look more like a starfish, and what does that mean? And if you were a company whose supply chain is more decentralized, do you want it to be more distributed? But those are questions. Those are some of the sorts of questions that boards of directors and C-level executives at large companies around the world are asking themselves. And then, of course, the related question is, if you're going to shift your network design from a centralized to a decentralized or distributed form, what technologies do you need? What new innovations do you need? The partners with whom you collaborate in the supply chain, because again, remember the definition, the supply chain is a network of organizations. They collaborate with one another. As you can imagine, not all the organizations in that network will have the same resources or the same capability or the same capacity. And so if you're going to change the design of your supply chain, what does that mean in terms of all the different partners with whom you collaborate in the network? So that's one framing, right? I don't know if it's the only one, but that's one framing of how I think the design of supply chain is going to change as we move past the pandemic. Then the other thing that I think is sometimes confusing is, so supply chains they are complex systems. They're generally big. If you're looking at things from a very high level, that they're generally big, and so the question can become, right, what exactly are the most critical functions that take place in a supply chain? And again, we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to explain it from a different vantage point so that it gets the point, it makes the point more clear. So the first thing that supply chains do is that they enable the flow of goods and services from producers to consumers, right? Again, remember the definition: a network, organizations, collaboration, production, and consumption, right? That's what a supply chain does. So the first thing is to enable the flow of goods and services. But just like I said when we were talking about supply chain finance, the second thing that supply chains do is that they facilitate the transfer of information about the goods and services that have been moved through the supply chain, right? So the transfer of information about the movement of goods and services between every entity that's part of the supply chain network. You can't have one without the other. If you have one and the other isn't functioning right, you're going to have a very inefficient supply chain. And one observation I like to make is that wherever in the world you live, whatever your reality is, that reality would not exist if there weren't supply chains. If supply chains did not exist, that reality would not be what it is. And one realization I came to, and I think this isn't something that we focus on enough, is that when supply chains are functioning the way they should, when supply chains are functioning as smoothly as they should, societies thrive. Right, and then even further, when I make the statement that the world is a supply chain, right? The title of the presentation is "The World is a Supply Chain." If you take it even a step further, and I'm by no means a philosopher, but I think this takes things somewhat into the realm of philosophy. But if you take things a little further, you realize that the world is basically a mechanism for enabling us to produce the things we need and consume the things we need to survive. You know, to my mind, that sounds like the definition we started with, right? The world is a mechanism that enables us to produce the things we need and to consume the things we need. That sounds like a supply chain, right? That's where the phrase "the world is a supply chain," that's where the phrase "the world is a supply chain" come from. But the truth is, and you know, just like I said, 2020 and 2021 have presented us with the reality that we can't take supply chains for granted. The truth is that supply chains are being confronted by some challenges, and I think we're at an inflection point in the world where this is going to become the issue that collectively, as you know, one human race, as humanity, we have to try to figure out, which is obviously what some of what was going on at COP26. So currently, if the trends hold, between 2015 and 2050, the world's population is supposed to increase by about 33% to roughly 10 billion people. And I'll show you why that is so incredible. Hopefully you can see this graph, and I'm hoping that the text is large enough for you to read. And this is the size of the world population over the last 12,000 years. So for the first 10,000 years of this graph, of this data, for the first 10,000 years, the world went from 4 million people to 190 million people. Right, just keep that in mind, from 4 million people to 190 million people. Over the next 2,000 years, it went up to close to 7 billion people, right? It was 7 billion people in 2011. So for 10,000 years, it was less than 200 million, which is, you know, less than, definitely less, far less than a billion. By 2019, it was at 7.7 billion. By 2050, it's going to be at 10 billion, like I said, if the trends hold. That is incredibly rapid growth, right? That is incredibly rapid growth. And what that means is that the supply chains that we rely on are just facing more and more pressure every single day. They're expected to accomplish more, they're expected to produce more, they're expected to deliver more. We're all impatient, right? We want whatever we want right now, at least in the United States. People want to buy something, they want it to be delivered in an hour. So supply chains are under a lot of stress. In addition to that, industrial supply chains, they consume a lot of natural resources in unsustainable quantities. They generate a lot of chemical waste that damages the environment. Again, that was a topic of discussion at COP26. And you know, if you watch the news, it seems as if there isn't a day that goes by without some part of the world experiencing a severe weather event. And the frequency and severity of these sorts of severe weather events is increasing, right? And when that happens, it causes a disruption to local and global supply chains. Trade disputes are increasing in frequency. And as China and the United States and Russia continue to jockey for influence on the world stage, this is going to become more of a problem that affects how supply chains function, especially since we're at a point in the world where a lot of manufacturing of the goods that we all rely on takes place in China and other parts of Asia, right? So trade disputes that cause manufacturing to not proceed as smoothly as it did in the past is a problem. It's a problem for all of us. And then, just like I said a few moments ago, the growing world population it creates a need for us to better dynamically manage resources throughout supply chains in every industry of the world. Consumers are changing in behavior. So not only are consumers in the West becoming more demanding and less patient, but in other parts of the world, as economies grow and improve and people become wealthier, they want to emulate the lifestyle of people, of the consumption patterns of people in the West. That increases the strain on supply chains. And then COVID-19 has woken us all up to the fragility of supply chains, and so the need for more innovation, where innovation is not necessarily just technology, right? So there can be innovation in terms of processes, innovation in terms of technology, innovation in terms of regulations, innovation in terms of materials and whatnot, innovation in terms of social organization. So it's creating the awareness that we need to implement more new, different innovations in our supply chains. And then the final factor that I think is not yet necessarily accounted for as much as it should be is that popular perceptions about supply chains are changing. And I don't know what the experience for you guys at home is, but at least in Europe and the United States, the sense I'm getting is that, the younger generation is realizing that there is a connection between how supply chains function and the climate crisis. And so, for example, fast fashion companies are being criticized more openly now than they were in the recent past, right? And the problem, as you probably know, with fast fashion is a lot of cheap products are manufactured. Those products are not all sold to buying consumers, and then the waste, the inventory that can't be sold, is either burned in incinerators or is shipped to other parts of the world and dumped. That creates a number of problems, right? One, even the stuff that is dumped can't all be sold, even when they mark it down completely. Two, the parts of the world in which this excess is dumped don't necessarily have the infrastructure to recycle or dispose of this waste appropriately. And so it's basically a situation where the West, through its supply chain choices, is now polluting and destroying the environment in other parts of the world, creating a situation in which the people who've caused the problem don't live with the consequences, don't live with the immediate consequences of their actions. And I think what's happening is that societally, young people are starting to realize that this is a problem, both in the near term and in the long term. So you know that there's a question, but why does the reinvention, you know, we like to say the refashioning of supply chains, but why does the reinvention of supply chains matter? And this is a point I've made in some other way, but I'm going to make it this way again, just to drive the point home. So one way to think about supply chains is that supply chains are to human civilization what oxygen is to life, right? When there's a lot of oxygen, we take it for granted, we go about our daily business, and we don't pay it any mind. It's only when there is a lack of oxygen and your breathing is impaired that you start to take notice, right? So when supply chains are working fine, we're all happy, right? There's no problem. We take things for granted. We go about our life. It's when they break down and when they start to fail that we realize that there's a problem. So this now gets us to the point where I think it is appropriate to ask, what is supply chain technology? And I've said a lot. So once again, I'm going to pause and I'm going to see if anyone has observations or questions before we delve into supply chain technology. If a few more people have joined us, and so if you just joined, I think Ophelia joined more recently. So if you've just joined, welcome. Where I'm trying to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have an observation, or as I often like to say, if you have a complaint, feel free to unmute yourself and let's talk about it.
Like I always say, technology and or nowadays, as we choose to call them, digital technologies are enablers of supply chains. In this case, supply chain. So
yes,
if you look at the explanation that you gave for Asia, what do you think of supply chains? They're thinking manufacturing. So now there's lean manufacturing, there's digitalization that is being introduced into manufacturing. There are also digital processes that are part of the supply chain. There's also, for us here in Ghana, we know that there are some soft investments that have been made to sort of drive the process of supply chain. And these are technological or digital in nature, in terms of the digital address system, for instance, and how now organizations like EMS, which is a government entity, are becoming more efficient in delivering items to offices and to households across the country. And I think that private delivery companies are also taking advantage of that as well. There are challenges with navigating around the digital addressing system, but the point here is that digital infrastructure is aiding the process of supply chains. And Ghana, our situation, I don't know what the others on this call might say, but our situation is not that different from what you have in the United States, where they look at supply chain more of logistics. So in this case, you have that digital infrastructure that is sort of enabling supply chains across the country. Of course, there are a lot of inputs and investments that need to be made, and a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of taking advantage of the opportunities, especially around with the inception of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, for which you'll be touching on. So I look forward to hearing more on that. Yes.
Yeah, that's a fantastic comment. Yeah, and you hit the nail on its head, right? That supply chain technology really is as simple as the definition on this page. Any technology or innovation that enables supply chains to function more effectively. And again, some of you might be like, oh my God, Brian really loves definitions. Yes, I really love definitions, but I studied math and physics, right? So if you're going to double major in math and physics, you probably need to be someone who takes to definitions. But so remember the definition, right? A supply chain is, first, it's a network. There are organizations in that network. The reason the organizations are in that network is so that they can collaborate with one another. And the reason they are in the network so that they can collaborate with one another is to enable production and consumption of goods and services. So any technology or innovation that enables that activity in that network between organizations to happen more effectively and more efficiently with less friction, that's supply chain technology. And again, like I said, sometimes the innovation, let's focus on the innovation part and less on the technology part. But sometimes the innovation is a regulatory innovation, right? Because there are times where the issues that create friction in the supply chain have nothing to do with the technology. It's more that there's a regulation that perhaps was fantastic in the 1960s. But in 2021, that regulation no longer makes any sense, right? At least in the form in which it existed in the 1960s, right? Maybe there needs to be an equivalent regulation, but it needs to evolve. It needs to be changed to account for the realities of 2021. So that's the thing I want you to keep in mind when you're thinking about supply chain technology. It's not necessarily anything really fancy. It can be something really fancy. It can be something really cutting edge, but it can also be something really simple. So that's supply chain technology. At Refashioned Ventures, the way that we have decided to think about supply chain technologies in 4 big buckets, right? So the first is next generation logistics. And for us, that includes things like industrial Internet of Things, cybersecurity, edge computing. So when Yao was talking about digital infrastructure, that would for us, digital infrastructure would be part of what we consider to be next generation logistics, because the reality of a lot of that digital infrastructure is that it is being rolled out in order to ensure that logistics services can be provided more efficiently at less cost. Then related to next generation logistics, and I'm jumping to this one because of its tie to digital infrastructure, is data and decision analytics. As you can imagine, in that network that we described, right? Again, the definition, network, organizations, collaboration, facilitate production and consumption. In that network, a lot of decisions have to be made all the time, right? There's a lot of making of decisions, choosing between alternatives. When should production be increased? When should it be decreased? Why should it be increased or decreased, right? All that depends on data and analytics. And so the next category that we think about is data and decision analytics. And for us, that includes things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, which you've definitely heard about. Those sorts of things fall under the data and decision analytics category for us. And it's tied directly to next generation logistics, because again, when Yao was talking about digital infrastructure, you roll out digital infrastructure to make it easier for data and information to be transmitted throughout the network, And that data and information is used to aid decision-making in the supply chain. Then the next area that we think about is advanced materials. So remember when I was talking about the fashion industry and waste, and that can be said, I pick on fashion because my co-founder Lisa has a background in fashion and apparel, but pick any industry that's producing physical goods, and there is probably more waste than is necessary. And so the question for us when we think about advanced materials is, are there new innovations and technologies? Are there new ways of capturing that waste material and turning it into new materials that can be used for something else, right? So in the technical term for some of these things is circular regeneration, advanced materials, lab engineered materials. If you've read about the companies that are trying to move us away from eating live meat from animals and eating meat that has been generated, that has been grown in a lab, right? That would fall under advanced materials. And then of course, related to advanced materials, if you've created advanced materials, if you've created a new way of taking waste plastic and turning it into a new type of material, then you probably also need to develop a new form of manufacturing to accomplish what you're doing in advanced materials. So advanced manufacturing is the final category when we're looking at investments. And for us, that means it's automation, it's robotics, it's on-demand manufacturing. And on-demand manufacturing simply means that you don't make something until the customer has actually purchased the thing, right? So you don't make a shirt until Brian has actually purchased and paid for that shirt. And the reason you do that is because you know that that sale is going to happen, as opposed to you make 10 shirts, you sell one. Now there are 9 shirts that you haven't sold, and those wind up in a dump or an incinerator somewhere. So those are the four big categories that we think about in terms of supply chain technology. They are not perfect, right? For something as big and as complex as supply chain, I don't think there is a perfect way to capture everything that happens. But we chose these because we feel as if, for the most part, let's say 75, 80% of the time, anything that we're looking at, we ought to be able to fit it under one of these categories. So the thing that I will say is, and you this might sound familiar just because of some of the things I've said before, but if you think about everything we do in the world, right? So if you think about global GDP, and we can bring this home, if you think about Ghana's GDP, if you think about Nigeria's GDP, if you think about the GDP of the ECOWAS community, if you think about Africa's GDP, all that is dependent on supply chains, right? All that GDP exists because of supply chains, right? If your supply chains are more robust, if they function more effectively, if they enable production and consumption without too much friction, your GDP is likely to be higher. And if your supply chains are not as efficient, then your GDP is likely to be lower. So for me, the thing that really makes me excited about supply chain technology as an area to invest in, especially from the early stage, from the perspective of startups, is like, I don't know any market that's bigger, right? Like in 2020 and 2021, I think global GDP is now north of $100 trillion. That's the size of the opportunity. questions, comments, complaints, thoughts? I'm going to pick on someone. Let me see whose picture am I staring at right now? I think some people left. I'm looking at Regan. Regan, do you have a comment, a complaint, a thought?
Hi, Brian.
you're like
Yeah.
Brian. You're like Brian. Pa. I'm sitting here minding my business. Why is
Okay,
he?
I think I
Oh,
have.
yeah, I'm just here to learn. So, yeah, I'm following. I'm learning.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Okay, so this is Obed.
Hi, Obed.
Yes, Brian. Yes, I think just a few comments. So, like you said, I mean, I think in terms of the technological part of supply chain processes, I mean, it's even in our part of the market here, it's really simplified things a bit for us. Because now, for some of the companies, it has presented a very simple platform where you can actually plan your consumption based on the market demands. So, like you were saying, if somebody needs a shirt, why do I have to produce shirts? Yeah. So let me use my end for example. So in the pharmaceutical space, what is happening now is that now you have the opportunity to plan your orders based on the demands. So you have, there's a hospital tender coming up. You have, the consumption of the facility, and the period for which they can consume certain quantities. So now the platform you have, it gives you the opportunity to alter your orders in the system. And you can actually trace it from the point of ordering to the point of manufacturing at the site. Everything is really simplified. So once a delivery is created for you, you can trace your order to the point where it lands at the ports. Before the delivery is created, you can actually make changes to your orders to adjust those that you need, those that you think you don't need them. Cut them.
In real time, you can adjust
in
real time.
In real time, yes. So for us in such industry, what would that mean is that now the quality of the products that will be coming into the country will have good shelf life. People will not run at losses because of expiries. Unlike the other years where once you put in the order, it's secured. You can't do anything about it. You can't make any changes. So I think for me, it's actually it's the way forward. Like you said, I mean, that's what's going to shape our thinking.
Yes.
And for them to, it also enables the people at the other end to also plan very well.
Yes.
Yeah, so you have real-time data, you'll be able to plan and then make adjustments to whatever you have. So I think such platforms will actually make it very easier. And it will interest you to know that even now, people can sit in their homes and even their prescriptions can be set.
Yeah.
People can sit in their homes now, they can have doctors or the platforms to interact with.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are all that has to do with supply chain. So for me, I think it's looking at the next 5 to 10 years to come. We're going to define supply chain basically as the dogma of our human life. Because I think that is how it's going to be put. Everything will be planned around that. So I mean, it's the way forward for us.
Yeah. No. Thank you, Obed. Thank you. That's a very interesting contribution because you're basically reflecting to me what I believe based on your experience, right? And the beauty when I first started thinking about this as an investment thesis in 2015 and 2016 or so, right? The thing that really captured my interest and what I learned with some experience since then is that the supply chain problem is the same problem everywhere in the world. And not only is it the same problem everywhere in the world, but it's a problem that exists everywhere in the world, right? It's the, just like I've been saying, and I know there were people who will leave this event, and when they're talking to their friends, they'll be like, so we had this presenter and he couldn't stop talking about the definition. He couldn't stop talking about the definition of supply chain, but I think just like you said, it's going to become the dogma over the next 10, 20, I would even argue the course of this century, right? Because climate change is such a big problem. Over the course of this century, supply chain is going to be the central thing that mankind has to deal with, right? We have to fix our supply chains so that they don't destroy the climate, they don't destroy the environment. So, as I was working on this, so this started as a blog post, then Lisa and I turned it into a booklet, and then we synthesized it into this presentation. But as we were working on the blog post, I was on email with a journalist at the Wall Street Journal. And she said, but supply chain is not really an economic problem. So doesn't that create an obstacle, because people are really focused on economic problems? And initially when she made the comment, when someone asks you a question which you haven't been thinking about directly, it can initially set you back a little bit, right? But then I thought about it overnight after reading her email, and I was like, no, she's wrong. Supply chain is absolutely an economic problem. Fortunately, it wasn't too difficult for me to find some research to support that assertion. And so the research I go to most often is from Mercedes Delgado and her co-author, Karen Mills. And I think at the time, both of them were at MIT. I don't know if they're both still at MIT, but at least in the United States, and I think the United States is a good benchmark to use, because I think in other parts of the world, the proportion might be higher. But in the United States, supply chain accounts for 37% of all jobs, 37%. And this is in an environment where one can argue supply chains work quite well, right? Quite well. Like I said, if you ask Americans today, they'll tell you, oh my God, supply chains are broken and blah, 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 blah. But for the most part, compared to other parts of the world, supply chains in the United States and North America function really well. And so if in an environment where supply chains function really well, supply chains account for 37%, let's just call it 40% of jobs. Then in environments where supply chains are not as advanced, what's that proportion? Is it 50%? Is it 60%? Is it 70%, right? So as you can see, from the perspective of an economic opportunity, it's a big economic opportunity. The other thing that the other way that we talk about it, and I don't think we describe it that way in the presentation, but you can think of supply chain as an economic multiplier, right? So if you studied economics in university and you came across the concept, fundamentally what an economic multiplier is, it's a variable in the economy that causes the economy to grow faster than it would have if that variable did not exist. That's really all it is. And so as you make supply chains more sophisticated, as you make them more resilient, as you make them more transparent, as you allow throughput through the supply chain to increase, what you're doing is you're increasing economic activity, right? You're increasing people's ability to consume. Because you're increasing people's ability to consume, you're increasing people's producers' ability to produce. And the increase in consumption and production leads to increased economic activity. So in a sense, supply chains serve as an economic multiplier. And then, you know, this isn't something that one has to spend too much time researching. I don't think there's something that requires a PhD dissertation. But if you look at the most successful companies in the world, they tend to be companies that you could describe as, within their industry, they have the best supply chain capability, right? So let's use Apple as an example. Apple is known for its excellence in operations and supply chain. I'll tell you a funny story. About 4 years ago, my son is 14 now. He was about maybe 9 or 10. And, you know, like everyone else who knows me, he got tired of hearing me talk about supply chain. So one day we were in the car and we were driving somewhere. He said, "Daddy, what's a supply chain?" So I was sitting there trying to explain it to him in the way that I thought would make sense for a 9-year-old. And then he stopped me halfway through my explanation. And he said, "Oh, so what you're saying is the reason we should always check Amazon if we want to buy something first before we go anywhere else is because they have an amazing supply chain and they can bring you what you want at your house, and you can play video games." Instead of, you can play video games instead of going out. You can play video games instead of going out. And, you know, at first I was like, video games? What are you talking about? And I was like, well, if you're a 9-year-old boy and the most important thing in your life is playing video games, yes, then
Sure.
a supply chain is whatever will allow you to play more video games. That's a
Sure.
supply chain. That's the but then it also got me thinking, right? I was like, wow, imagine if you are Walmart, right? Or one of the other companies that's competing with Amazon. And the way a 9-year-old understands Amazon is that they have the best supply chain. And they make it possible for him to play video games with his friends. Like, what does that do in terms of like how your customers are thinking about how they interact with you, right? When they want to buy something, are they first going to go to Amazon or are they first going to go to Walmart, right? That's something that I think is interesting to consider. So, you know, and I won't spend too much time on this because I don't know if this is very relevant for you guys, you know, but overall, I think that early stage technology is going to play an important role in this transition that we're describing, right? In the scenario that Obed talked about with pharmaceuticals, where he works, right? There's a need for investments in technologies that are just being invented or being created in innovations that are still very nascent, or even ones that have not yet been created yet, right? They're still just an idea in someone's head, or they're still a research project in someone's lab. And that's the role of early stage technology venture capital. Our argument is that the opportunity is so big, the problem is so important that it's not changing fast enough, right? There isn't enough capital that's focused on supply chain technology. And so then, you know, one final set of questions that we get is, what can different segments of society do? So if you're an individual, it's being more aware of how your consumption choices affects supply chains, right? How the choices you make about what you consume and when you consume them play out throughout the supply chain. If you're a government entity, it's thinking more critically about how regulations that either exist or do not exist might create impediments or roadblocks to the smooth functioning of supply chains. If you're an investor, right, whether you're an individual investor or an institutional investor or some other private investor, is thinking about where you deploy your capital as time unfolds. Because again, like I said, climate change and supply chains are opposite sides of the same coin, right? The climate is changing. We're in a climate crisis because of the choices we've made with how we design man-made supply chains. And so if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we have to reinvent, or as we prefer to say, we have to refashion supply chains. And it's not just supply chains in one part of the world, it's supply chains all over the world. So that's really it in terms of this presentation. And I'll send the link to Yao so that he can share it with you guys. But I'm going to pause there. Let's talk a little bit. And then while we're talking, I told you I have an article. I wrote an article in January last year, which I'll bring up on screen and which we can use to center the conversation about the Africa Continental free trade area. And I think I saw one of my classmates just join from Xavier. Let me see if he's here. I'll put him on the spot.
Yes, Eric.
Kopi, what's up?
Charlie Brian. Charlie, you are lost in action.
I know. I've been MIA forever. Oh Lord. Thank you for joining. So questions, complaints, comments, Dr. Tina J, I'd love to hear your observations. Douglas, I'd love you to jump in. And say something.
Okay, Brian. I think that, I don't know about the others, but I've been just nodding my head vigorously in the office right now. And since this is on record, I would go ahead and say that I feel and I believe quite strongly that in Ghana specifically, about 50% of our problems is supply chain. And
I agree with you.
and if we are able to even get 30% done, just 30%, I am envisioning such a dramatic change in our fortune. Everything that we are struggling with currently, everything can be connected to supply chain. Post-harvest losses, uncontrollable increases in prices, inflation, difficulty in managing and profiting from small businesses, logistics challenges, everything. And it always hurts me to keep repeating this fact that you see, in Ghana, we don't solve problems. We just pretend to solve them. And we take a lot of populist decisions to appeal to a group of people without really looking at what is the root cause of an issue and actually implementing solutions that would change or cause ripple effects in productivity. So if we are able to work on these things, these 4 buckets that you presented, and specifically the ideas that technology can bring into our system, because you are looking at a small business who is whose whole price setting is controlled by how much it will take to take the product from the production site to the consumer. And the price changes drastically because he or she has to now use private persons to deliver. Some businesses don't survive because that particular gap causes people not to want to buy. We have a lot of stuff stuck in the northern part of Ghana, and a lot of consumers are in the southern part of Ghana. But currently, you can't move from Tamale to Kumasi and go back without experiencing extreme stress or spending so much on airfare. It's disjointed. The disconnection is serious. So I think these ideas implemented properly will change the fortunes of Ghana, especially small businesses and entrepreneurs. I am excited that we had this conversation. I just hope that it's not just one more conversation, that we have shared fantastic ideas and then we go back to business as usual. Sorry for talking too long. I get
no. The beauty of a small group like this one, and whenever I'm doing an event like this, there's part of you that wants, oh my God, we want 100 people to show up, and wouldn't it be amazing if there are 500 people? The trouble with 500 people is that you can't have the kind of dialogue that we're having, right? You can't have the kind of dialogue that we're having. It's more impersonal because with that many people, no one wants to make a comment. But there's a sort of topic where I think it's small groups like this talking, sharing ideas, and then going off and trying to act on those ideas. That starts the small ripple that perhaps can have a big impact. The thing I'll say, and this is something that makes on the one hand, it makes supply chains exciting. At the same time, it also makes it difficult, is that there are aspects of supply chain where the issues are so gargantuan that only government can really tackle them, right? So Dr. Tineje, some of the issues you touched on are issues that have to do with physical infrastructure, right? What are the states of the ports in the country? What is the state of the road network in the country? What's the state of the rail network in the country? What's the state of airports in the country, right? When I was growing up, when I was going to secondary school with Eric and Wa, the airport was not really an airport that could be used to move freight in any meaningful way, right? One would hope.
Now it has changed, right?
That's fantastic news, right? Because think about what you can do in terms of moving goods, especially perishable goods.
But Brian, sorry to Yao said it's changed, but it's still just only one airport.
Yes.
For the whole country. Just one.
No, it means from Wa coming to Accra.
From Wa to Accra, from Wa to Kumasi,
so now
from Wa to Tamale.
We have Obuasi, there's Sunyani, there's Kumasi, Ho, and things like that. Obuasi, for instance, if not for the mines, is hardly used. Same as Sunyani, which is being rehabilitated. But the point here is that there are some assets available. The state of the asset might not be that great because there's an airstrip in Bolga, but the point is that we need to be able to move away from that. We need to be able to have at least an aerodrome in each regional capital, so that movement of goods across becomes easier.
Yeah.
But of course,
and what's up with the rails? I mean, why are we not even having this conversation? As a country, why are we not taking the rail system seriously?
you know, roads, the road network, that's a really important network, because trucking, right, as important as ports and the airport network is and whatnot, trucking is really the backbone. Trucking is really the backbone of any economy, right? And so the road network is really, really important. I remember one time I was school had closed in Xavier, and we were traveling to Accra on a Citra bus, an STC bus from Wa. And the roads were so bad, the bus broke down somewhere in, I think it was somewhere in Brong Ahafo region. Do you know we were stuck in the middle of nowhere for 1 week? Just think about the loss of economic productivity. Right now multiply that across the whole economy, right, happening multiple times a year, multiple times a day, and think about the loss in economic productivity that creates, right? So it's just like I said, the physical infrastructure, which is something that's so big that only government can really tackle it in a meaningful way, that plays a role too. It's not just technology and innovation. There's also, hey, we need roads and we need ports and we need those sorts of things.
Brian, there's McCarthy on from Tamale Hopping Academy. He runs a transport organization as well. I think in the supply chain he has a couple of companies. So we may want to touch on some of the challenges that he's going through trying to move goods across the country, and how this is relevant for him. McCarthy.
Hi, Senior Yam, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Sorry I had to join late. I traveled in today back to Tamale from a lot of Galamsey. So please, again, your question again, please. I missed a bit.
You know, Brian was highlighting, I would say Brian is originally from Wa.
I was actually
Okay.
I was actually born in Tamale. I was born at the Tamale General Hospital.
Oh,
nice.
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he was highlighting earlier on about the challenge he had felt while back in secondary school, trying to make the journey from Wa to Accra, and the roads situation, loss in productivity.
Yeah.
And then of course, generally we are talking about the state of roads infrastructure.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Since you are in the sector, I want you to make a comment.
It's crazy with the whole road construction issues, because our machines kind of, when you buy a product, a car or a bus or a vehicle to plow Tamale Boga or Tamale Wa, you calculate the depreciation of your car based on 5 years or something. But unfortunately, sometimes it depreciates within 3 years, and it's a problem for, you know, working out your investment and getting your investment back, because bad roads, your tires get damaged earlier than you calculate your depreciation. Engines, you know, are stressed out with bad roads, and you know the drivers have to climb multiple speed ramps. These are technical issues with some vehicles and all that. And I think the roads are the most is the pathway to connecting into different places. And any place you see road constructions get better, the place becomes really shorter. You don't see it as a distance again. Places get closer to each other when the roads, lines and everything is good. This is the technical, but the human aspect too is a lot of death and accidents. You know, you lose a lot of precious lives and all that on bad roads and all that, which is it's unfortunate, which is more even concerning than even the economic aspect as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that observation. I'm going to share my screen again, but the conversation we're having now is appropriate, right? So I wrote this article. I used to be a columnist for Freight Waves from April 2019 to April 2021. I wrote a column at Freight Waves, and the unique thing about the column I wrote for Freight Waves is when Craig Fuller, the CEO, when he reached out to me and asked me if I'd consider being a columnist at Freight Waves, and it was a weekly column, so every week I had to deliver something on supply chain and innovation and technology. And the unique thing about the column was he really gave me freedom, and he said, Brian, you basically decide what is interesting and important for readers to pay attention to that week, and you write about it and submit it. It was my first time attempting to be a journalist, and in January of 2020 I decided to write about Africa and logistics capacity, and especially to focus on startups. So I'll just go through it, and we'll talk about some of the things that I highlighted, and hopefully, given the context of the presentation, this should make sense. So the World Bank has a metric that it calls the International Logistics Performance Index, and when I was writing this, I used the 2018 rankings, but basically think of the LPI, the Logistics Performance Index, as a ranking of where countries fall in the world in terms of supply chain, right? So, and again, remember, supply chain is more than just logistics, but if you remember when we talked about the definition and the three big categories of supply chain, I said that logistics is the linchpin, right? That connects supply chain management and supply chain finance and everything else that happens in the supply chain. So think of Germany in 2018. Germany had the best rank of 1, and there was an associated score. But what you notice is that African countries did not do that well. South Africa, so Africa did not show up in the rankings till number 33. And then Cote d'Ivoire and Rwanda at number 50 and number 57, respectively. Kenya came in at 68, Benin and Mauritius at 76 and 78, respectively. Ghana and Nigeria did not show up until 106 and 110. And I know that for us Ghanaians who like to think, we're the best in Africa, etc., this must make you guys very, very, very unhappy. When I read it, I was very unhappy. And when I first read this, I was very unhappy. The only thing that made me happy, I said, at least we're better than those Nigerians. And then I said, at least we are 106 and Nigeria is 110. That's the only thing that made me. That's the only thing that made me. But as you can see in this paragraph, I said Nigeria. The fact that Nigeria is 110 on the Logistics Performance Index completely boggled my mind. Like I said, I grew up in Nigeria. My parents still live there. They live in Kano, not even in Lagos. So that there's just as we're talking about the problems, Accra, Wa, Accra, Tamale, Accra, Bolga, etc. Same issues if you live in northern Nigeria. But Nigeria is the continent's largest economy and the largest population. So what does it mean if Africa's largest economy with the proportion of the population that Nigeria has is ranked so poorly in terms of logistics? and supply chain infrastructure in general, right? That's something I want you to think about. You know, by comparison, China is number 26, Vietnam is number 39, Malaysia is number 41, India is 44, Indonesia is 46, Turkey is 47, Mexico is 51, Brazil is 56. This one surprised me. I didn't expect Russia to be number 75. I thought Russia would be somewhere in the top 20 or top 25. I was surprised that Russia is number 75. You know, then this other observation, which I'll highlight from this 2013 paper, Aid for Trade and Value Chains in Transport and Logistics, right? One well-known connection between transport and logistics and development is in facilitating international trade transactions, which under appropriate circumstances boost national income, reduce poverty, and thus contribute to economic and social development. So not only is this an issue for like consumption within Ghana, right? But it's an issue about how effectively Ghanaians collectively can trade with the rest of the world, can trade with the rest of West Africa, can trade with the rest of Africa, can trade with the rest of the world, as I said. And then, and this is the paper, no, I don't think I mentioned this, but one of this paper, this 2019 paper by Roche actually hit me quite hard. So I've told you about growing up and about going to school in Xavier. I come from a village called Namvli, which is 20 miles from Wa. And so when Xavier was on vacation, when school closed, I couldn't always go back to my parents in Nigeria until long vacation. So I would go to the village, I'd go to Namvli to live with my grandfather who is a peasant farmer. My relatives are peasant farmers. And each time we got home from the farm in the evening, it was my responsibility as his grandson to take his bike and ride around the village. He had really chronic rheumatoid arthritis. And so at night, when it was time to go to sleep, he would have pains in his bones. And so my responsibility was to get on his bike and ride around the village and look for the tablets he needed to take in order to help him be able to go to sleep. And you know, when you're living your life and you're like, it's what it is, you do it and you don't think about it. But then in 2019, you know, developing this thesis and, you know, researching and whatnot, I read this article. And the thing that struck me, so Roche is talking in that article, Roche is talking about their pharmaceutical supply chain, and Obed, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But Roche is talking about their pharmaceutical supply chain in Nigeria, right? The argument I make to people who haven't been to Africa is, look, if you know what things are like in Nigeria, you probably know what things are like in Ghana, right? And as I said, using the LPI with Ghana at 106 and Nigeria at 110, right? That's a fair assumption. It's a very accurate statement to make, right? The logistics systems are not that different. But what really made my blood boil is that because of suboptimal or broken supply chains across sub-Saharan Africa, compounding costs at each node in the supply chain sometimes leads to markups as high as 700%. As high as 700%.
Wow.
What that said to me was, every night when I got on that bike to go around looking for those tablets could have been marked up by 700%. And think about this in the context where, you know, people in villages are earning, I don't know, $1 a day, $2 a day. You know, when we talk about those kinds of numbers, I'm like, that doesn't make sense, because I know if I go to the village right now and I tell my grandmother I'm going to give her $2 every day, she's going to be like, oh my God, I have never seen that much money in my life. What am I going to do with all this money, right? So that realistically, they're probably living way, way, way below the World Bank's poverty line or the UN's poverty line or whatever international organization is setting the benchmark, right? And they're dealing with prices that could have been marked up by as high as 700%. Just for context, the low end of that range is 40%. The range was 40% to 700%. And I just thought that was mind-boggling, right? That, to me, this is one example of why this is such an important issue. And I'll keep quiet and let someone jump in. I actually talk about it in the article, right? The next paragraph is where the next paragraph is where I try to summarize that story.
Yes, you had wanted Obed to. Oh, sorry. Doug, go ahead.
If Obed is ready, he could talk.
No, you go ahead. I think you are the one.
Yes, I stepped out. I just came in, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, from what Brian was, the example that he gave. For example, if I want to buy, if I see a book on Amazon and I want it in Ghana here, sometimes the book could be priced at, say, $8.99. And then if you work through the checkout and everything, you realize that the shipping and the delivery to an Accra address is about, in total could be as much as $60. So imagine if a book costs less than $10 and to get it to you is $60. That is just one example.
Yeah.
There are a lot of items here produced in Ghana here, where if you are just in the next town from where it is produced, the price could be as much as triple that, simply because getting it from where it is produced to where you are, the kind of struggles they have to go through before it gets to you, actually makes it not worthwhile investing in that particular idea. And it flies across board. So when we speak about these things, I just keep thinking in my mind, what are some of the, because like you said, a lot of them are infrastructure and they cannot be done by individuals or even startups or private companies. It has to be done by government. But what can we do? What are some of the things that we can do that would be easier to do, but would cause a lot more difference in our current state? Because we are discussing the problems. We know the possible solutions, but it seems that we are going to have to deal with the fact that we can't do anything about it. And that is not something that tastes good in my mouth at all. So what can we do? Are there opportunities? Are there spaces for individuals? I recall a couple of years ago, Joy FM was doing a series of entrepreneurial seminars, and they gave certain state institutions to certain individuals. And then the question was, if you were given this particular institution, what will you do about it? It stands very, very clear in my mind because Maximus was given the Ghana Postal Service. I think this was like 6 years ago or so. And he used, is it Netherlands or one country's strategy where they converted the postal service using their already established infrastructure and then turned it into a logistics hub where it became more of like the middle person between private entrepreneurs and business people and consumers, where you could drop items at their offices where they use their facilities to bridge the gap. it was something that was really exciting, but of course, it was an idea that was shared. No one picked it up, and then we are still here. So is there something that, Brian, that we can do? Because for me, it will be sad for us to have this exciting conversation and not be able to do anything.
No, the believe you me, the what can we do about this is a question I think about often. And I think that some of the things that one can do require private capital, private investment, and some of the conversations I've had with with some people, in both people I know in the US and especially people in Nigeria, right? They're like, oh my God, Brian, you should focus on raising a fund to invest in startups in Africa, right? Tackling these types of problems, because and I didn't talk about this, but I started another organization again with Lisa called the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation, which you can see in the logo, and on my shirt you see the New York Supply Chain Meetup. But we started a supply chain technology meetup in New York that became the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. But basically, the parts of the world where innovation in supply chain will have the biggest impact on people's lives, developing parts of the world. So think Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, those parts of the world, Eastern Europe. But like I said, for some of these things, waiting for government is not realistic. There's a point at which you need private investors to start making investments. The issue is that if you're developing this sense, you're not wrong, that the problems are so big that this isn't something that $10 million is going to make a difference in. This isn't something that $20 million is going to make a difference in. Like, this is something where you need a big pool of capital. And so people are like, oh, you should. I'm like, one, raising a fund for someone like me, raising a fund to invest in startups in the US is difficult. If I now went and said I'm raising a fund to invest in startups in Africa, it would be next to impossible. So the approach that I am taking, and I've discussed this with a few people, I haven't discussed this with a lot of people. First, execute on building a fund investing in the US, right? Execute on that. Once you execute on that and you prove that you can do that well, God willing, LPs are the people the investors who put money in a fund and say, okay, fund manager, go and invest this capital. Once you prove that you can do that well, when you say, hey, here is another aspect of our thesis. There's a big opportunity in Africa. We think that opportunity is undertapped. We have the team in place to go and execute on it. Will you give us the capital to put to work? Not everyone will say yes, right? Because not everyone has the appetite for the sort of risk that comes with investing in technology startups in Africa. But there'll be enough people who say yes, that you should be able to raise a significant fund to be able to do it. Now, there are problems for all these things. And I really like the example that Dr. Tina J raised. It's almost as if I wanted to bribe him to choose a example favorable to what I know or what I have to say. I couldn't have picked a better example. But the example of a book, right? The physical thing that is a book is a great one. At my old fund, KAC Ventures, where I learned the business of venture capital, I think in 2013 or 2014, I met a company. It's now called Guten. At the time, it had a different name. I think it was called Breakout Commerce or something like that. And the basic idea was, rather than doing manufacturing in a centralized way, why don't we think about doing manufacturing in a decentralized, in a distributed way, right? So Dr. Tina J, let's think of the book right? The supply chain technology textbook by Laung Aoaeh, which you so desperately want to buy, from Amazon, right? Or some other marketplace. It doesn't have to be Amazon. What the big idea was, you go and make the purchase. Instead of the book being shipped from a warehouse in the United States to your home, the book would be printed in Accra, right? The book would be printed and bound in Accra, and then it would be shipped to your home. And the idea was, if we extend the timelines out long enough, let's say you now live in Wa, or you live in Tamale, right? And I'm expanding this example just because we were talking about the difficulty of logistics between Accra and Wa, or Accra and Tamale. What if you lived in Wa? What if, instead of the book having to be printed in Accra and sent to you in Wa, what if it could be printed in Tamale? Printed in Tamale, bound in Tamale, and then shipped to you at your home in Wa. And now think about if you expand that across different types of products, right? So a book is just one example. It happens to be a very convenient example because the mechanics of manufacturing a book, not easy, but not that difficult. But what if we could do this for other types of products? What would that mean, right? And some of the technologies that make this possible are becoming more mature with every year that passes. And so I would say that, 10 years from now, we should be seeing that happen much more frequently. Do I know if 10 years from now it will be ubiquitous all over the world? No, I do not know. If I could make that sort of prediction, I'd be in a different business.
Well, I think that for the example you just gave, I think it's being done, but it's not as widely done as you are describing. So I know that there are several printing companies in Nigeria that buy the rights from authors of books, and then they distribute for the African market. So it becomes easier and cheaper to get the books from Nigeria than to get them from Amazon. The only challenge is that because they are buying the rights, and if you want to buy rights that are a little more affordable so that you can make profit, the books would have to be in the market for at least a year, meaning that then you don't have access to current books. You only have access to books that authors feel they'll be able to make enough money in other markets that they can just sell off their printing rights and get something, salvage something, because they know obviously they are going to be bootleg.
Right.
So they would just have to settle, and then, but it has to be at least sold for about a year. So that is what is being done currently. But like I said, I feel going forward, it's going to be easier. The only challenge probably would have to wait for the mechanisms to get cheaper so that it can be more distributed, yes, and then more decentralized. So yes.
Like one question that people could be thinking about, well, what are some of the enabling technologies that would make this sort of distributed or decentralized printing or manufacturing possible, right? So one is, like Yao mentioned, digital infrastructure, right? So we don't want, the old system is you write the book, you sell it mainly in the West. After you think it's run its course, you sell the distribution rights to some publisher in Nigeria. They print 10,000 copies of the book. They try to sell it. Unfortunately, they can only sell 1,000 copies of the book, and so the rest is waste. I think about what we talked about, on-demand production, et cetera, et cetera. In the new dispensation, right, with distributed printing, distributed manufacturing, et cetera, right, the book would be created. It would exist in digital format, and the author would retain the rights to the book, And so when Dr. Tina J decides to buy the book in Ghana, what he is getting is not a book that's 1 year old, not a book that's 10 years old. He's getting the current version of the book. It's being sent to him as a digital file. It's being sent to the manufacturer as a digital file with whatever encryption or digital rights management needs to exist. It is printed from the digital format into a physical format, and then it's shipped to Dr. Tina J. So let's use the numbers that Dr. Tina J used in his discussion, right? The physical book is $8.99, but logistics and shipping is $60, a total cost of $70. That's prohibitive. He doesn't buy the book. He decides to wait and has to deal with all the inefficiencies and hassle that comes with not getting the book when he wants it. In this new case, perhaps the entire thing, because there's no the logistics and shipping has been drastically simplified or cut out of the equation. Maybe the whole thing comes to $20. And he's getting a current edition of the book. So you can see how that. Oh, and by the way, the manufacturer in Tamale or in Accra or in Wa or wherever it is, that's a source of jobs for people in the community. So there's digital infrastructure. There's obviously intellectual property law. There's some things that have to change there. If the author is in the United States, or whoever owns the rights to the original version of the book is in the United States, there has to be some sort of agreement between Ghana and the United States, probably negotiated through the WTO, that makes all this possible. So like I said, I don't know if this happens in 10 years or 5 years, but I think that's sort of the general direction in which things are heading to some extent. There's obviously room to critique if this will actually be a reality or not, but
yes, Brian, we are about 4 minutes to wrap up.
Yeah.
So maybe if you want to maybe wrap up in your presentation, and then we can have some inputs and next steps quickly before it's 4 p.m. GMT.
Yeah. I think, and like I said, I'll share this with you so that actually, I'll share this with you so you can email it to the attendees. I'll send you the 2 links. I think the one thing I'd like to end with, and if you're looking at the screen is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area can act as a catalyst for supply chain logistics technology startups and innovation. But one difficulty about investing in startups in Africa, in technology startups in Africa, is that there's 54 different countries, each with its own regulation, each with its own currency, each with its own infrastructure challenges. And so that creates an obstacle that's hard to overcome. And if the agreement, if the free trade area gets us to a point where there is more uniformity and startups can scale, then it becomes easier to attract capital into those startups. I think that's the one observation that I'd like to wrap up with. And with the balance of time that we have, questions, complaints. Brian, you don't know what you're talking about. I like those 2. Eric, do you remember when we went to Notre Dame in Bolga? Yeah. And I think, what was it? Was it a debate or something? And people were booing at me. People were booing. People were booing at me because I used to stammer. I used to stammer in my speech in secondary school. And I was thinking to myself, you guys are booing at the wrong person. I'm going to stand here and stammer until all of oh, Lord. good. Anyway,
But
yeah, comment.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think you've done a yeoman's job
Thank you.
of
Thank you.
taking advantage of the Ghana Digital Innovation Week and taking us through the world as a supply chain and helping us to understand. Of course, we've had very interesting commentary from those of us who participated, and we having that agreement that a lot of our challenges that we have as a country are due to supply chain issues. And as a next step, we probably will be thinking around what is it that we can do to be able to sustain the enthusiasm and stuff like that. So probably propose, might be a sort of a hard ask, but maybe so just like you have the New York supply chain meetup and things like that, we can do similar for Ghana, and maybe start some discussion around it. But even before that we can begin to think around monthly webinars around supply chain, where we just have short conversations around what is going on, or maybe we bring a problem and then we try to discuss it and solve that problem on that web. And I think it's something that we can maybe continue the discussion and maybe start in January, mid to late January, and then run it through and see what comes up out of it, and then start discussions around the meetup. We realized that those who were on the call are people who are within the industry, so it's easier to start some engagement around it, sort of sustain the enthusiasm, and then build from there. So I'd like to very, very much thank you for spending time with us.
You're welcome.
And spending time with us, spending your early afternoon to
Thank you, Brian. Mr. Brian.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Senior Yao.
Yeah, and it's good that you have at least there's you've met Eric on the call.
Yeah. I'm just hoping he doesn't connect with a bunch of you and tell you stories about me from our time in Xavier. If Eric tells you anything, it's all a lie. It's all a lie. It's all a lie.
It's not a lie.
Don't believe anything
Maybe
he says.
Eric,
Yeah, there's a lot, I'll tell you.
Yeah, we need to work around bringing him back once a while. To do some projects up north, and then we'll see.
Oh Lord,
we'll see how it goes. Yes.
Yeah.
Hey, Brian, Zagzoma, Brian.
Oh no! I don't know what you're talking about. It's a lie. Like I said, Eric is a liar. Don't believe him. Don't believe anything he says.
All right. So thank you very much. And this recording will be made available.
Yeah.
As well, and for us to go through, take our time and go through and savor some of the nuggets, and also for those who were not able to join us to be able to enjoy it. I think that's the content is what is most important, so that people can have access to it and enjoy it. So thank you very much. If there are no comments, I would like to have a seconder to bring in this webinar to a close.
Well, I think on that note, yeah, thanks for prodding me and suggesting that we do this. I've wanted to do it for some time. So this was an honor. This was an honor.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
And then we look forward to collaborating more.
Yeah. And if we don't, the rest of you, if we don't connect before the end of the year, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Let's hope that this pandemic that this pandemic doesn't follow us into 2022.
Yes.
Yeah.
We pray for that. Pray for that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye. Bye, guys.
Bye. Brian, join the 92-year group. Join the 92-year group, Brian.